if my English isn't very clear, just feel free to jump in. Or if I talk a lot of rubbish, jump in as well. So basically, going to cover two parts. Overview what the issues with the triplet-bearing ewe and her lambs, and also then our guidelines for ewe management to maximise the chance that that triplet-bearing ewe rears her lambs and they're of good weight. So here's actually some Australian data which just explains why we're interested in triplets in New Zealand. The bottom axis is scanning percentage. As scanning percentage goes up, the black line is the triplet percentage, and you know, if our farmers are weaning 170 plus percent, we're getting, you know, well over 200% scanning, so we're getting a significant proportion of our flock with triplets. So that's just naturally what occurs on an average scanning percentage. That'll be the average mix you'll get. And so you can see why, for us, for a while now, we've been looking at triplets. So in terms of the triplet-bearing ewe, in comparison to her singleton twin counterpart, she's under significant metabolic stress in late pregnancy. Whether you measure that by some of the measures of fat breakdown or the levels of glucose in her blood, she's very compromised. And we know in New Zealand conditions, under that grass-based diet, and that's the diet that our sheep have, we don't use concentrates or grain supplements, it's just herbage-based. We know that under that grass-based diet, she physically cannot consume enough in that last couple of weeks before lambing and in early lactation to meet her requirements. So she has to use this, her body reserves, to get through that period. You know, we've selected for an animal that's very fertile and fecund, and the consequences of that is it doesn't actually meet its environment very well. And just to give you an idea how much that mass is, of this triplet-bearing ewe, you know, the day before she lambed, the conceptus mass, which is between the mass of those three fetuses, plus the fluids and the placenta, is 20 to 22 kilos. So if you start with a 55 kilo ewe at mating, she better be 75 kilos the day before she lambs, because the day after she lambs, she's actually lighter than what she was when she was mated. And that's the cycle those ewes get in. Twins, if you're interested, is around that 14 to 16 kilos, and singletons 9 to 11 kilos. So you can work out, if you actually want your ewe to end up in good condition at lambing, what the total weight change should be in your flock during pregnancy. We also know that she doesn't produce, the triplet-bearing ewe, she doesn't produce proportionally more colostrum than her singleton and twin counterpart, and the colostrum's generally of poor quality because she's under that negative energy balance state in late pregnancy. And what she tries to do is she buffers using this, so on average they're in poorer body condition going into lambing, and that has negative consequences for the chance of the survival of their lamb and how much milk she can produce, and therefore the weaning weight of that lamb. And of course, triplet-bearing ewes have lower survival themselves over that lambing period than a singleton and a twin-bearing ewe, so they're more likely to succumb or die. The lamb itself, they themselves are born, because mum is under negative energy balance, they're under a negative energy balance. That's the reason why they're smaller at birth. There's not as much energy in the system, so they can't grow as much. Soon after birth, they have lower levels of glucose and fructose you can measure in their blood. Within 5 minutes of birth, which is about as quick as you can get a thermometer stuck in them, they're colder. And they remain colder on average for 12 to 18 hours. And if they're colder, that negatively affects their suckling drive. So they're less likely to suckle, which isn't very helpful. They're also colder. One of the reasons they're colder is because they're smaller. And if you think of your fist in relation to a balloon, your fist, which is smaller, has a greater surface area to its mass ratio, so it dissipates heat more readily, and it also has smaller distance from its outside to its core, so you cool down quickly. So that's a real issue for those triplet lambs, and that's what sets them up to be cooler. Not only are they smaller at birth, because their mother's in a negative energy balance, there's less energy in the system, so in those last few weeks when they should be laying down their fat, which is brown adipose tissue predominantly, around the heart and the kidneys, which is the fat energy they use for thermoregulation, soon after birth to keep them going in a cold environment, they have less of it. Okay? And although when we've measured the capacity of a triplet-bearing born lamb to produce body heat, on a per kilo basis, it can produce just as much body heat than its twin or singleton counterpart. Because it's smaller, its total body heat production is less, but it also has a greater surface area, so it's producing less body heat, but have a greater ability to lose it. And they've got less fat, so they can maintain their body temperature for a shorter time in an adverse weather event. That's why they have lower survival, coupled with all those other issues. They have behavioural issues as well. People have looked at behaviour. The bonding ability of the triplet-bearing ewe, her ability to find her lambs, to rebond with those lambs, is worse than a twin-bearing ewe. She takes longer. So people have done some work where they've separated them by 20 metres and then recorded the behaviour over the next 10 minutes. She's less likely to walk to her lambs. She's less likely to bond with all 3 lambs, if doing that at all. Okay? And the lambs themselves, because they're born in a negative energy space and they're getting less milk, they actually take less, their behaviour is compromised as well, and a good indicator of that is they take longer to stand and to suckle. So that progression of behaviours is also negatively affected. And if they take longer to stand and suckle and it's cold and wet and shitty, well, they're less likely to suckle and they're more likely to die. So there's all those things that occur. Oh, the reason I should be going backwards, not forwards. And the reason I've got that photo is that's a common scene. The triplet-bearing ewe, although I acknowledge this isn't within the first 24 hours because those lambs are clearly older than that, but she's driven to eat. She's in a negative energy balance. She's driven to eat. So she actually spends less time bonding soon after birth. And if you think back to the previous photo where I showed the ewe giving birth, she's eating this particular ewe here. Why she's giving birth? Because she's driven to do that. And so you get this scenario where she's off grazing and these lambs are getting left progressively further behind. And you get that separation and death occurring. These are survival data. There's only 29 studies in the literature, and they're predominantly from New Zealand and Australia, where they've looked at survival of singleton, twins and triplets together, in the same conditions. And this is survival of lambs based on ewes lambing. Okay, it's not on ewes mating, because these ewes have already been identified as going to have singles, twins or triplets. And you can see about 2/3 survival rate in twins, or 67%. Oh, sorry, in triplets, 67%. But in the literature, you can get up to over 73%. In New Zealand, on our farms, farmers will have a number of paddocks with triplets in, and they'll tell you their mob averages and their triplets go anywhere between 180 to 230 or so percent. So, which is in that kind of, 65 to 80% survival ballpark occurring. So, which ones are most likely to die? Well, you'd all better tell me that small lambs, and you've had this drummed into you before about twins, small lambs are the ones most likely to die, and if you can improve the birth weights of twin lambs, you'll get better survival. Well, the same thing happens in the triplet here. Heavier birth weights, you get higher survival in triplets, but you note for the same birth weight here, 4 kilos, the triplet has lower survival. And this is Australian data with triplets from the Lifetime Maternals Project. So, yes, improving birth weight's important, but even at the same birth weight, they just want to die still as well. And if you look at litter survival, the smallest lamb within the litter is most likely to die, and there's a number of reasons for that, and I've discussed most of those. It's more about its competitive ability. And I showed you the slide 3 back, where there's a ewe with 1 lamb suckling on one side and 2 on the other. When you look at all the studies where people have looked at suckling ability of single, twin and triplet-bearing ewes, you'll see on average, the biggest lamb within the set, he or she gets that same side of the teat all the time. That's their side. And the other 2 have to just compete. And that repeatedly occurs, you see that in the studies. So the 2 smaller lambs are not so competitive against the big one, and they have to share the teat. And of course the smallest one gets less. And on average, a singleton lamb spends about 60% of its time suckling in comparison to a singleton or twin. So they're getting less milk. And we do know too, when we've done a meta-analysis of lamb survival of triplets, which just means we've got a whole lot of data and put it together, highest litter survival occurs when you've got the smallest variation litter weight. So in other words, if you had a litter with 3-4 kilo lambs, their chances of survival is higher than if you had a litter where there was a 4 kilo and 2 5 kilo lambs born. Even though you might think, surely the survival's higher with those 2 5 kilo lambs. That's not the case, because there's a competition more likely to occur. So if you can reduce variation in litter weight at birth, you get higher survival. Unfortunately, we don't know how to do that. But that would be the optimum. Cause of death, it's very simple to say that most of the deaths are starvation exposure because of small lambs, and I talked about the thermoregulatory issues. But of course, the triplet bearing ewe, because she's in a negative energy balance, she's weaker when it comes to giving birth. So she's more likely to have a prolonged birth process, and that last lamb is therefore more likely to be oxygen starved if the last lamb to be born, or hypoxic. You're more likely to get fetal entanglement because there's 3 in there trying to come out that one hole, or mispresentation. So dystocia shouldn't be underestimated in triplets as well. And then of course you get that combination of causes where the ewe or the lamb is damaged in some manner during the birthing process or compromised. It affects the ability of that lamb to suckle. You get a cold environment and it dies of starvation exposure. So it's a combination. In terms of growth, the triplet bearing ewe, in the studies where we have milked her, and other groups around the world have milked her, produces somewhere between 0 and 20% more milk than a twin bearing ewe. So you can kind of work out how much proportionally less those lambs are getting. Now, Jeff Hinch, who some of you might know from UNE, way back in 1989, measured milk production in single and twin and triplet bearing ewes and growth rates and energy demand of lambs, and found that within 3 weeks, by week 3, already a triplet bearing ewe isn't producing enough milk to meet those demands of those lambs. And that's why in triplets, you see another blip of lamb deaths. Most of you would tell me, oh, most lambs die within the first 2 or 3 days, and that's true. And once, usually if a singleton or a twin gets past those 3 days, their chance of survival is pretty good. In triplets, though, you get another burst of deaths. It's not a very good word, but you get some more deaths occurring at around week 2 or 3, and that's just because there's not enough milk, and that competition within the litter set for that, and one lamb can often starve off and die. And the lamb at that stage cannot compensate fully for that lack of milk. The lamb's rumen, using a bit of a ballpark figure, he or she can only eat 30 grams of dry matter per kilogram of live weight. That's about 3%, right? That's about how much they can consume. So they can never buffer against that less milk proportionally, and that's why, as you all know, triplet lambs are lighter at weaning. There's often greater variation in weaning weights within triplet litter sets compared to twins. And in many of the studies in literature, and farmers will tell you this too, you've seen it yourself, you often think, geez, I just want 2 good twins are better than 2 triplets. Because often what happens is the triplets are lighter because they start off lighter at birth. Okay, and then often for a few days there they've had their litter mate alive competing for that milk, and they never really catch up. So there are our issues. So that was all the positive part of the talk. So what I'm going to do now is talk about what are our farmers advised to do based on the research that's been going on in New Zealand for triplets for nearly 20 years now. Now, I'm not going to tell you that every farmer does this. I'm not that naive. But farmers are doing as much as they can of this, or tweaking these type of things to do what they can on their farms to try to improve survival. Because you can't stop triplets. Okay, if you're selecting for fertility and fecundity, triplets, you just can't stop. It's a goat that you can select for to be a repeat 2-2-2, but we somehow, when those skills were being handed out, the sheep didn't take that on. Right, if you want to maximise triplet survival, it starts right back at breeding. It starts back at selecting for sires whose progeny are going to have higher survival. And we see more of emphasis going on in that at the moment. Farmers are looking, not just on our indexes, looking at rams where they rank on the maternal index. The maternal index is made up of a number of traits, and actually reorganising the rams based on survival, because they're saying, I'm already at the fecund end, I don't want more bloody lambs, I want those born to live. So you want sires whose progeny have a greater chance of survival, and you want sires whose female progeny then go on to be your replacement ewes, their lambs have greater survival. They're 2 different things. Okay? And we also see individuals, and there's starting to be, so-called survival traits being selected for, and I could list a whole lot there. But I just listed a few. Mothering ability, skin thickness is a thing that some breeders are now selecting for, because we know that lambs born with thicker skin can cope with the cold a bit better, and there's some survival genes. So there's many things. But the other thing I do want to say here is time of breeding is very important. In the New Zealand scenario, when we are pasture-based, if you're going to maximise lamb survival, you want to be lambing in the period where there's less of a chance of poor weather, but probably more importantly, you want to be lambing so that in very late pregnancy, the last 2 weeks or 3 weeks of pregnancy, pasture growth is occurring. So there's grass coming. And when she lambs, there's grass coming. So it's a false economy to lamb early, thinking if I lamb early, the lambs will be older at a set time point. Therefore, by definition, they must be heavier, so I'll make more money. That don't work. You're better to lamb slightly later, get high lamb survival, and because you're lambing later, her milk production will be higher. And more often not, they actually catch up anyway, if not pass. Okay? The sheep that we've got, that we're so proud of, their peak milk production is at week 3. And by we, I mean all of us. We haven't selected for sheep that produce milk, most of us. We've selected for other things for hundreds of years. Peak milk production in merinos and in coarse wool breeds, the ones that have never been selected for milk production in terms of human collection of milk, their peak milk production is week 3, and she's all downhill from there. And once you got past week 3, you can't actually have another peak. Okay, so you need that peak occurring when there's feed. Because if here's the peak, it's about being as high as possible, because the area under the curve is how much milk you produce, which any dairy farmer would tell you. They'll tell you, calve at the right time to get a maximum peak, and then you're calving so that she's fed well and the lactation curve declines the least, doesn't go like this. Okay, but if you lamb too early, you get a smaller peak and you go like that. And therefore you get the shit weaning weights that you've got. Right. Body condition scoring. As I said to you, in New Zealand, the way we body condition score is you should be optimal range around 3, 3.5. You can be a higher body condition score, and in most traits you might get a small increase, but we would argue the efficiency of that extra feed required to put on that extra bit of condition is not there. We talk about minimising the tail. These animals that are way down here, and the further they are down here, the drop off in performance. So you probably heard me say this morning, we often talk about, because we're pasture feeding and our ewes are on rotation all year round except for the 3 months of lactation, having a truck and trailer type approach with, say, 15 to 20% of your ewes going ahead in the rotation, getting a pick, gaining in the condition. As you heard me say this morning, we don't worry about the exact numbers so much. We talk about just focusing on that bottom 20%, okay? Because really they're the ones that are having the biggest impact on your overall flock's performance. We also say some farmers like to, some farmers will take a lot of measurements and they'll say my average weight of my ewes is X. My average body condition score of my ewe is X, and next year I'm going to improve my average. Well, body condition score average is a crock of rubbish, because you can have an average of 3 by having all your ewes at 3, or by having half your ewes at 2 and half your ewes at 4. That'd be a bloody disaster. So body condition score, thinking about an average is a waste of time. You should be thinking about what's the percentage of my ewes below 3 and trying to minimise that. If you want to use body condition score as a target to see that your ewes are doing better or you're feeding better rather than average. We would argue, very, very similar to Australia, there'd be 4 times a year you should body condition. And fecund ewes, highly fecund ewes, body condition score at weaning is very important, because from that weaning to rebreeding, in approximately 100 days, is really the only time you've got when she's not pregnant that she can put on some condition. And in a highly fecund ewe, it doesn't matter how you feed her in New Zealand, because we don't use those concentrate or grain supplements, she's going to have to use that. So at weaning, condition scoring ewes are important. Luckily for us, the vast majority of our flocks are shorn within a month of weaning in New Zealand. It just happens to be the timing. And, it's not hard to body condition score off shears. I'm not going to tell you should touch every ewe, because we all know that off shears most of you don't, because you don't need to. Correct? Right. Even though the models will tell you should touch them off shears, you can if you can't work out your bottom 20% ewes off shears for being thin, you should just stick to cropping. Pre-breeding is another good time. We're often vaccinating our ewes then, so you're in a drenching race. So by definition, you're touching them, right? You are. You're walking up, pushing your way through, unless your sheep just step to the side and let you come through, because they're used to some of your Australian males being in the race with them. Doesn't happen like that in New Zealand. Our sheep are very frightened of us. So you're touching them anyway, so you could identify your bottom 20% there and just mark them, okay? And you repeatedly every time those sheep, those 4 times a year, remixing that mob up. And hopefully she gains condition, she goes back on the main mob, and she's fine then, okay? So it's about, you've only got so much feed. Okay, if you put all of these, if you've got to use across this band, and you've got X amount of feed, the fat ones never say to the thin ones, you eat it, right? So, but for the same amount of feed, you can target those thin ones because it requires less feed to put body condition score on them than it does on those fatter ones. Because remember, body condition score is predominantly fat, which takes a lot of energy. Mid-pregnancy, we're pregnancy scanning in New Zealand, 90% plus. So, our sheep don't like going on that crate. You've got to push them up, usually, so again, you're touching them. That's another good time to do it. And approximately 40% of our farmers are resharing then as well because of our crossbred sheep we share twice a year. So it's another easy time for body condition. And then set stocking, we're vaccinating 3 weeks out. So that's we're vaccinating pre-lambing, and set stocking means you put sheep in all of our paddocks. About 95% of your paddocks will have sheep in for lambing. And if you're going up that drenching race, it's a way of just saying, those thinner ones, I need to put them in the paddocks with more cover. And then so in that truck and trailer type approach of those 15 or 20% sheep out in front, they're being offered slightly above maintenance over that weaning period through to rebreeding, and the others are being offered maintenance. All of our farmers pretty much now well in the high 90s scan, and they have been since the 1980s. And not only are they doing singles, twins and triplets, our scanners are doing early versus late as well. And they're getting very accurate at that. And that allows you to make informed decisions. That, coupled with body condition score, allows you to make a hierarchy of sheep on your farm that need it the most in late winter, just before lambing and lactation. It's your early lambing ewes that need it first. Your triplets need more than your twins. Your thin twins need it more than your fatter twins, and your singletons and late lambing ewes need it last. Okay, so you can make informed decision on how you actually use your feed resource. If you just give it to them all at once, again, those that don't need it won't say the other ones, you take it. And that's costing you money because you're trying to do it as an average to bring them all up, but you don't need to. Especially in New Zealand when we're lambing in late winter, early spring, those late lambing ewes, by the time they lamb, it's in spring. So they can be pushed harder through the winter. Okay? And we also use that information, that body condition score, and knowing what pregnancy rank they are for selecting paddocks for lambing, and I'll touch on that in a moment as well. So in New Zealand, a lot of field studies across the country have been undertaken to work out the optimum feeding conditions in pregnancy and lactation. And predominantly we're grass-based with a bit of clover. We overestimate how much clover we've got, but predominantly we're grass-based. In mid-pregnancy, highly fecund ewes, twins or triplets, we would say only graze down to, in our sward, 9 centimetres, just about 900 kilograms of dry matter, at about 2 to 3 centimetres sward height before you move them on. And at that level, if you're moving them in your rotation, they'll be gaining weight. That's slightly above maintenance requirements. If you graze down to about 6 to 700, that's about maintenance requirements. So the highly fecund ewes, your triplets, and some of your poor condition twins would be grazing down to that level, being moved on, and the singletons, etc., coming in behind because they can be pushed there a bit harder. What we use is a lot of brassicas in the winter, turnips, swedes, kales. They're planted in summer, autumn to be fed as a bulk feed in that winter period in mid-pregnancy to allow the sheep and often cattle to come off the grass so that grass covers come up before late pregnancy and lactation. So that's what we do rather than using concentrate supplements. So that would be the period. However, those brassica bulbs are 90% water, some of them, so they can't be fed out in late pregnancy. If a ewe needs, this is a ridiculous example, but if a ewe needs, she does need 3 kilograms of dry matter, a triplet-bearing ewe, in the last week before lambing, and if she was eating a brassica bulb, she'd have to eat 30 kilos of turnip. It's about a wheelbarrow full. And our ewes have as many teeth as your ewes do, so she'd be sucking on them. They can only be used in mid-pregnancy. We know in late pregnancy, as I said to you, they physically cannot eat enough triplet-bearing ewes in those last couple of weeks to meet their theoretical requirements under our ryegrass white clover. Therefore, we have to feed them at the very least so we're not limiting intake. And in our situation, with our ryegrass-based sward, which is green, a bit denser than yours, with very little dead matter at the bottom, that's not going below 4 centimetres or 1,200 kilograms of dry matter, the way we measure it. Okay? And ideally, that should start 4 weeks before lambing. Unfortunately, of course, our farms, just like farms here, you never have the theoretical amount of feed you should have, so many farmers delay that to a couple of weeks before lambing. Okay? But if they were doing it properly, and if they could do it properly, there'd be 4 weeks before. And when there's not enough feed to do that properly, it's about thinking about which ewes need it the most, because you've been through scanning. Our crossbred wool's not worth a lot, so our sheep, you have a few colours on their head or on their neck, because they've been sprayed with the early, late versus single, twin, triplet. Often the twins are the ones that are not sprayed, because they're the most, hopefully. So the others have the other colours. That's how we identify them. But if there's not enough feed there, it's thinking about, maybe the single bearing ewes and the late lambing ewes and the better conditioned twins, I'm not going to be able to do this here. I'm going to have to go down to 1,000 or whatever. Okay? So that's how you'd make that decision. And as I've alluded to, it's too expensive in New Zealand to use grains or grain-based concentrates, so it's not really available. It's too difficult to feed them out on hill country, and the soil's generally too wet to, even if we could feed them out, to get high utilisation. So they're not used, and nor do we use those feeders, and that's mainly because of the cost of the grain. Just to show you, I'm not making those figures up about the feeding levels. This graph on the left here, each of those points is a study, not an individual sheep. And this is the post-grazing pasture mass, so that's how much we've left behind before we've moved to the next paddock. Because remember, our sheep are in a rotation during winter. And this is the live weight change of a ewe in mid to late pregnancy. Now, a triplet-bearing ewe will easily be gaining 300 grams per day in those couple of last weeks before lambing. Because we know in the last 5 days before being born, a lamb's putting on 100 to 150 grams per day. So if you've got 3 in there, it's easy to put on 300 grams per day, let alone the fluid. So to ensure she's at least putting on about the 300 grams per day, we can't graze below that 1,200. Okay, so those guidelines have been really well characterised for New Zealand. There's a photo I put up before in my first talk. That's not enough feed. Over here is actually about 1,800 to 2,000 kilograms of dry matter. The reason I do that photo is, yes, from an intake point of view, I'll tell you not to go below 1,200, but if you do have the feed, which would rely on a very good winter and a good autumn, having slightly more pasture there does provide a level of shelter for the lamb as well. And it also means the ewes more settled when she's lambs. She lambs and she's not driven to go over there to eat. If the pasture's like this floor, she's not driven over there. She'll stay closer, and therefore their bonding is better and survival is better. In terms of shearing, as I said, a significant portion of our flock is shorn in the winter. You can use mid-pregnancy shearing to increase lamb survival, twin and triplet lamb survival, by 3 to 5 percentage points. That's because by shearing, so if we were to shear a ewe today and put her outside, just like we actually just took your clothes off and put you outside, you'd feel the cold, and what your body does, because most of you are mammals, you'd speed up your metabolism to produce body heat and break down the body fat. And there's more energy in the blood system, crudely, crosses the placenta, you get increased fetal growth, the lambs are born on average 300 grams heavier, and you get that 3 to 4% higher lamb survival. Now that's how that works. And that only therefore works if she's got some of this. If you shear her and she's thin, she'll feel the cold, yes, and she'll go to break it down, but there's nothing there. So if you use mid-pregnancy shearing as a way of improving survival of twins and triplets, she's got to have some body condition. And she's got to be fed slightly above maintenance. We also use a cover comb, which leaves 8 to 9 millimetres of stubble, 7 to 9 millimetres of stubble, versus the standard comb, which is 4 to 5 millimetres, just to give her more protection. The risk of her death as well. We're trying to limit that, because then you definitely lose the lambs. Late pregnancy shearing can increase lamb survival, but it's a different mechanism. Late pregnancy shearing to increase survival is about forcing the ewe to seek shelter when she lambs because she's cold. So you're shearing her in the last month of pregnancy. It's too late to affect the growth trajectory of the fetus because it's already been set by then. She feels the cold. If you've got paddocks with shelter, she'll seek shelter, and that's how you get your survival response. Okay, so they're two different mechanisms. Though we would say, if she's carrying twins or triplets, don't shear in the last month before lambing because the metabolic risk of her dropping dead on you is very high. If you think mid-pregnancy shearing causes a ewe to seek shelter, you're dreaming. At 0 degrees, at 0 wind run, with 10 millimetres of wool, a ewe is thermoneutral, which means she doesn't feel cold or hot. Okay? But if you shear her at day 70 using a cover comb, leaving 7 to 9 millimetres of wool, when she's got another 78 days to go before she lambs, she'll grow about our Romney Coopworth type animals will grow another 2 centimetres of wool, so she'll have 28 mils. So she ain't feeling the cold. So she ain't looking for shelter. She'll just lamb in the bloody stupid spot. Okay? So there's 2 different mechanisms to use shearing to improve survival. Management and set stocking. Ideally you'd have your paddocks so that in lactation the covers don't go below 1200, because remember that's when you maximise intake. So hopefully you've set your rotation up, our farmers, as they're going around paddocks, so that those paddocks that they're going to give to their triplet-bearing ewes and their twin-bearing ewes are the paddocks with a higher survival and more shelter, and they'd graze them earlier so they'd had time to come up. Okay? And then you'd put your triplet-bearing ewes, your early lambing ewes in those paddocks. And what our farmers do, as I said, about 95% of the farm will have ewes and lambs in each paddock, and they'll put singletons in some paddocks, twins in others, triplets in others, and they'll adjust the stocking rate, or how many ewes they put in each paddock, to hopefully maintain pasture covers in that 1200 or above range. And so it might be common to say have 16 singleton-bearing ewes per hectare, maybe 10 to 11 twin-bearing ewes, and around the 4 to 6 triplet-bearing ewes, to keep the feed demand the same on a per hectare basis. Okay? And that's what they'll do. And then, of course, when you don't have paddocks all above that, which is often the case because the winter's been hard, and those paddocks you've clearly just been out of in the rotation, they'd be the ones that you'd put your singleton-bearing ewes in, because they are the ones that can buffer the most. And their lambs are less affected if the pasture cover is not quite as high in our scenario. Would avoid steep paddocks. The work hasn't been done in triplets, but in twins we know that once you get above 30 degrees, you've got a 50% chance of separation of the ewe and the lamb, and triplets would just be worst. So avoid on your farm, triplets should avoid the steep paddocks, and ideally you've got paddocks with shelter, not just a bunch of shelter in one corner of the paddock, because with triplets that's just a nightmare, because they'll just all lamb together and you'll have all these lambs in this one spot, and you just have mismothering and just have a bunch of dead lambs. So you'd have dispersed shelter. An important tool that's come about now that we are pregnancy scanning is that, like Australian farmers, and the other group suggested by the way they smiled and nodded at me, that a lot of Australian farmers collect their little diaries and write down a lot of information. A lot of Australian farmers, when it comes to tailing or marking, love to count tails. You just do, you just count the tails. But because we put singletons and twins and triplets in different paddocks, and we've been scanning for a long time, our farmers actually know how many fetuses are in each paddock, or how many lambs are going to be born in each paddock. And then if you count tails, you know actually for each paddock its survival rate. So over a few years, you'll get the average survival for each paddock on your farm, and you'll know which paddocks on your farm have the highest survival. And you might look at a paddock and think, Jesus, I don't know how that has the highest survival. But it does. And therefore you set your winter rotation up, so those paddocks with the natural highest survival are the ones that are grazed first, so the covers are highest by lambing, and you put your triplets in those. Okay? Just using information that most of you, if you are pregnancy scanning, probably have in that little diary that you never open, but you always write those diaries. Okay? But you've got that information there, you get that for free because you have been scanning. That's why scanning is such a good tool. It's not just about knowing what potential your flock's got and telling you how many lambs are dying. It's not just about targeting feeding, but it's also about identifying which paddocks. And you can also use that scanning data, of course, to select which paddocks you select your replacements from as well, if you just want to select twins or triplets as replacements, by knowing those ewes are in different paddocks. Mineral deficiencies and vaccinations are important with triplets, just like they are with all lambs. And working with your veterinarian is important to address those issues if you have any. As I said, we don't grow enough herbage. Sorry, that's not what I said. Our triplet-bearing ewes cannot eat enough in late pregnancy and early lactation ryegrass white clover to meet their theoretical requirement, so a high quality feed is important. So lucerne has got another bit of a kick in New Zealand. There's a lot more lucerne being grown, and herb clover mixes, and by herbs I mean chicory and plantain in mixes with clovers, because we've shown on all those types that you get high, long as there's a legume in that mix, and with that plantain or chicory, you'll get higher milk production, higher lamb survival, heavier lamb weaning weights, and the ewe at weaning, triplet bearing ewe, is also in better condition. So her flow-on effects are better in other years. So in districts in New Zealand where we can grow these, and you're lambing not too early that you can't lamb on these. If you're lambing too much in the winter and those herb clover mixes or lucerne hasn't come away yet, then you can't lamb on those. But in areas where that has come away, farmers are lambing in those and getting very high performance. In areas where they can't lamb on them because they're lambing slightly earlier, come marking or docking, they're walking the ewes on there in their lambs. And it's been shown to maintain the lactation curve. So she produces more milk for longer. You get a heavier lamb, and when that lamb is grazing, it's grazing a better quality feed. So and remember, it's rumen restricted by that 3% of its weight. So therefore, it for every little bit it eats, it gets high performance. What we do though is we set stock on those up until pre-lambing through to marking or tailing, and then rotationally graze after that, because you can't permanently set stock on those plants without killing those plants. So there is some different management that has to be done as well. Interaction at lambing is always a big debate around farmers, and one you can easily get into a big argument about. Should you get in there and interfere, or being in there to try to save a lamb kills other lambs? It comes down to this. If your flock or your ewes are accustomed to your interaction, then it's probably worthwhile to interfere. To whether that's assisting lambing, or whether that's mothering on, or whether that's stealing orphan lambs, whatever you want to call it, then it's worthwhile. But if your sheep are not accustomed to your interaction, you will cause more problems. And so therefore, if people are going to do this, we would argue that, on your farm, if you're going to do this with triplets, you would spend a couple of weeks from, say, set stocking to lambing, going through those paddocks twice a day, so they're getting accustomed to you, and you'd be lambing in that flatter country anyway, because I've already said avoid the steep country, and that flatter country, they see you more regularly, and so therefore you can get around them easier. Something that's happening, which I wouldn't have thought would ever happen in New Zealand, and it's been happening in the last few years, because the price of lamb is so high, farmer innovation is coming up with ways of keeping more of those lambs alive. Because there's a mismatch between milk demand and supply, we have farmers spending time fostering on lambs, putting the smallest triplet onto a ewe that's lost its lambs, or onto a ewe with just one, because their time is more than worthwhile paid for because of the value of lamb. Or they're actually getting into systems of, which I thought would never occurred, artificially rearing lambs. You can now get, we call them lamb terriers, so machines that can you put milk powder in that can rear 200 or 300 lambs. And more farmers are doing that if they've got lots of triplets. They're using their covered yards and setting those up because their covered yards aren't being used during the lambing spring period, and rearing lambs in there. And you often find farms, especially in the South Island on the easier country, where they've got 200-300 lambs like that. It's becoming more and more common, and there's lots of field days and there's information booklets on how to do that. So it's becoming popular. But when lamb price crashes, that'll all stop. So for those lambs, they're lucky at the moment, they get an extra few months to live. Early weaning is a strategy also, because we know that our sheep peaking at week 3 and then their lactation curve is declining. If pasture or grass covers get below 1,000 kilograms of dry matter on our conditions, the ewe and the lamb in late lactation become competitors, and you're actually better off to wean early. And people are weaning at 18 to 20 kilos down to 14 kilos and putting them on these feeds, and they're growing faster than being left on mum at that 900 to 1,000. And you can put a hell of a lot of 18 kilo lambs on a hectare of that. And you can also, it's good for the ewe because she's not lactating, so she's more time to gain condition before next year. So you see those flow-on effects. I just want to say I'm privileged enough to be involved with this project that's just started in the last just over a year in Australia, last year. It's a multi-facet project and involving research organisations from across Australia, WA, South Australia, Victoria, New South Wales, and ourselves in New Zealand. And as I said, it's multifaceted. It involves been involving surveying, interviewing farmers, discussing with farmers what type of research is required, because we want to create management guidelines for the Australian scenario for triplets, and that'll probably differ based on environment. So, and it also involves field trials. So this lambing period, we have trials. There are trials being undertaken in various parts of Australia on farm, trying to come up with management guidelines. So if anyone's interested in that, talk to someone from one of those groups, because there's scope to be involved with that in terms of doing something potentially on your farm next year if you're interested, as we try to develop guidelines that are specific for the various regions in Australia for those triplets to get the best outcome for her and her lambs. So in conclusion, the triplet-bearing ewe and her lamb is compromised, and I just outlined what we know about them. And generally on most farms, the performance is below potential, but you've all seen ewes rear a good set of 3 lambs. So the potential is there, and it's about making that more consistent. And while we have guidelines in New Zealand, and we're certainly using those guidelines, if a farmer can use those guidelines or just manipulate them slightly to work on his or her environment, then they do get higher performance, but it's still far from perfect, and we're still working on that. And as I said, we've got good guidelines. They don't yet exist for Australia, and that's what we're trying to work on. Thank you.